He wiggled his other hand and it moved okay. He used both hands to fully zip his jackets up and pull his hood up. His hood had a little snow in it, and he wiggled the snow out so he wouldn't freeze his head, and then shuffled his glove over his hand to get anything off that, then put his hood on. He tried to stand up, and it took a couple tries. He eventually used a tree as leverage and climbed himself up until he was upright and leaned against the tree. Doug looked around and saw a ton of tracks in the snow. It looked like paw prints and dragging. There was wreckage everywhere. He turned around and looked at the tree, and there were metal pieces above where he was that looked like they'd only barely missed his head. Doug carefully and quietly walked around the crash site to see what there was to see. He walked back and forth until he understood the trajectory of the crash landing and found the cabin of the helo. The cabin was all in one piece, and the chairs were in place and no bodies. He checked the area for the pilot and pulled open the door. Mike was there and was unresponsive. Doug took one of his double-layer gloves off his hand and checked for a pulse. Mike was unsurprisingly dead. Doug checked for his dog tags, and he didn't have any, so he grabbed Mike's wallet instead and put his glove back on. The cabin wasn't on fire or anything, which was good. It allowed Doug to take a moment and say a silent prayer for Mike, that the helicopter angels would take him up to helicopter heaven with all the other brave pilots that crash and die so that everyone else can continue. With that done, Doug looked around again, feeling pressed for time. Some fires had tried to start, but in the snow and the pressure and the way they crashed, it wasn't going to happen. Their packs were laying everywhere, as they'd only been set in the back for easy access. Doug easily found his, as it was the last one to go in. He pulled it out and inspected it. It was intact, so he grabbed his sunglasses out and put them on and put his pack on. It had warmed up a few degrees, and there wasn't any wind, so he didn't need to put any extra layers on yet. He looked down at his wristband and tried to assess where Challenger was, but the arrow was moving back and forth and all around. It needed to be resynced, it looked like something had done a soft reset on it. His watch was decently shielded from magnetic interference, so unless it was a hit from a direct major blast specifically at it, it was fine. He bumped the compass button and figured out which way he was facing, as well as his coordinates, then bumped it again and it went back to timekeeping mode. He needed a map to verify what those coordinates exactly meant, as he didn't have a map, not knowing where he was going. Doug looked around and still saw no survivors, but drag marks everywhere. He went back to the front of the helicopter and found the backup map for the pilot and silently thanked him. He looked at the map, and as soon as he checked on the crew, he stuffed it in a special pocket in his jacket for map-sized objects. He eventually found the tail of the helicopter. It was smashed off on a tree 20 yards away. The helicopter definitely wasn't going to be flying again. Doug was going to consider himself lucky, and then remembered on this model of the helicopter's maiden flight that the helicopter suddenly burst into pieces mid-flight. The tragedy sent the approval of the helicopter back a year and greenlit a ton of new safety measures as they were able to figure out all the failure points. That's the only real reason why everyone survived. This helicopter definitely didn't come down by itself. He patted it on the side gently in a show of appreciation and then sent out to find his crew and best friend in the whole world. They'd been through way worse than this, and he was sure Challenger was fine. He didn't call out for her, though, because there was no way to know if the bad guys had come to check out the crash. Doug followed a few of the drag marks the wrong direction before realizing they were all pointed in a single direction. Doug got into his pack and got out his trusty rifle, his FNC. He secured a mag in the mag well and racked around as quietly as he could and make sure it went back in the chamber okay, then popped open the buttstock and snapped it in place. He had his sidearm available as always, but wasn't messing around. He followed the drag marks for 100 yards into the woods. After about 100 yards, he started noticing quite contrasting blood smears on the ground. First, he would see a single blood smear, and then that would go away, and then you'd see a drag mark from another direction. And then there'd be a blood smear from the other direction. Doug drew his rifle and kept stomping through the snow as quietly as he could to where these drag marks went. Eventually, after several hundred yards through the forest, he felt a pair of eyes on him. He looked around and saw nothing. He took a few more steps and heard a low growl. It sounded, or rather the rumble felt like it was a little over 20 yards out. He put his rifle down with as much authority and confidence as he could muster and said, "Challenger?" The rumble stopped. That was either good or bad. Doug shuffled to the left and right, and nearly imperceptibly silent, heard something step forward. He looked around in every direction and tried to step towards where he heard the noise. "Challenger?" Doug tried again, this time with more confidence as he realized his voice was shakier than he thought. He heard very distinct charging through the brush and rolled his eyes. Sounded like a bear running through the forest, but he already recognized that crashing anywhere. There was his best buddy in the whole world. She stood up and easily put her paws on his shoulders, wanting to give him big kisses. He struggled to hold up both of their weight, not that he could do anything about it, but he tried to resist and get her down anyway. Her face was covered in blood, but upon inspection, thankfully, it didn't seem to be her own. She got down, having been relieved that her buddy was alive, and thought for a second. Then she was reminded of something and tried to lead Doug off somewhere. Doug stopped her for a second and synced his electronic tether to her. It spun around for a second, recalibrating, then latched onto her. She felt a little vibration that warmed her heart, reestablishing her with a sense of normalcy. That having been done, she guided Doug back through the trail she'd been working on. Chapter 18, Doug, Camp, Afternoon, Day 1. What Doug saw next was definitely a sight to behold. There was his crew strewn out everywhere. Apparently Challenger had pulled them all from the crash one by one into the place where she thought the most logically safe. They were even under trees so they couldn't be seen by aircraft. Then she brought them all food, as there were dead animals everywhere that she had expertly caught. I don't think they taught you that in dog school," Doug said to Challenger. She dropped her mouth open in a pant, blood all over her muzzle, as if to smile at him proudly, tail wagging. He went over to her and got out her bowl and squirted some water in it. She was very thankful for this, and he kept pumping water in until she was done. He wiped her muzzle off with some snow as best as she could. They were trained to not bite when she had her head down in food or water, but he was never completely sure. After she was cleaned up and had water, he drank a bunch of it himself. It wasn't frozen yet, but it was definitely cold. It was easy to get dehydrated, surrounded by tons of undrinkable water. He searched the camp to check on everyone's injuries, and they were all unconscious, but nothing life-threatening from what he could understand. Doug debated the mission versus his crew, and he resolved that the mission could go screw itself, and that the safety and integrity of this crew came first. He immediately had an idea, almost like his response to the situation triggered it. A good idea. He dropped his pack at the site. Hopefully, if any of them woke up, they would recognize it and figure out that he'd be coming back for it. Doug then started walking off and padded at his side. Challenger immediately followed. She wanted to protect the rest of the crew, but she knew they were safe for now, and whatever Doug wanted to do was more important. They walked back to the crash site carefully by mostly memory. Only had to check his watch for direction once. Thankfully, there was no sign of anyone else discovering the site yet, if they were looking. He grabbed some paracord that he'd found in the cabin and lashed all of the packs together so they were in a stack and would glide easily without the snow getting in them. Then he lashed the packs to Challenger's harness. When that was done, he grabbed some loose branches that he'd found on the way there and told Challenger to go. She thought for a second and figured out what was going on. The stuff needed to go back to the pack that she dragged to safety. Off she went, and Doug used the branches and the fresh falling snow to cover their trail. Challenger would head off about 20 yards ahead, get the vibration from the collar, and know to stop. They did this all the way back to camp, and Doug noted that he did a pretty good job at covering the tracks by shuffling the snow around with his branches. He now couldn't even tell exactly which way they'd come from. He tried to cover up the blood with snow, but stopped because the fresh snow above was covering it pretty well, and it was making their return trip too long. Within a few hours, it'd be like they'd never been between the two spots. He unhooked Challenger using the carabiners he'd scavenged on the helicopter. She was happy to have it off, but seemingly to be perfectly okay with dragging the load also. She ran around and went and found something to do, probably was licking every single person on the face that was unconscious. That cracked Doug up, and he let out a little chuckle. "You lick all their faces all you want, puppy dog." She looked at him with appreciation for the approval. Doug also had saved all the emergency flares from the helicopter, as well as the oversized onboard first aid kit. He grabbed the big first aid kit and set it aside and set the road flares on top. He found a shovel on someone's pack and started digging a hole, trying to get to bare earth. He wouldn't be starting a fire now, but he would by nightfall. Even if he marched there without the crew, he wouldn't be to the dam by dark, based on the map. He took a second to review. Making a dusk raid sounded interesting, but he wanted the enemy to feel comfortable. They'd stay up hardcore for the first 24 hours and think they were successful with their helicopter stunt that they somehow pulled, and be exhausted by the time Doug's team hit them at dawn. Doug at first maybe thought the helicopter got hacked, but then he thought it was a series of EMP bursts. Maybe it was a little bit of both. Whatever it was, nobody was going to risk another helicopter until that system was shut down.